Alright guys, so Deuteronomy 30 today. Ton of stuff, absolutely. Ton of stuff. I don't know if I'll be able to get it all in one. I'll try and keep the video relatively short, but I still don't want to miss a lot of stuff that jumped out at me. Keep in mind that in verse 29, or in chapter 29 rather, God had told them that, hey, if you forsake my covenant, basically your enemies are going to come in and they're going to scatter you. You'll be basically taken and scattered amongst all these nations. If you start worshiping other gods, if you disobey my commandments, basically if you drift away from me, I'm going to remove my hedge of protection, as Isaiah 5 says, and you'll be taken by these other nations. So you can see that God is actually using other nations to judge Israel, his chosen. But there's something that, just amazingly profound that I want you to see is the reason behind this. And when we get to chapter 30, verse 1, it says, "And it shall come to pass, when all these things are come upon thee, the blessings and the curse, which I have set before thee, thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee." So he tells them here, he was like, when all this stuff comes to pass, so keep in mind that Israel is not in the land yet. They haven't taken possession of the land yet, but God is telling them, you're going to get into the land, and then you're going to leave me, and you're going to get scattered amongst all these nations. But when it happens, he says, thou shalt, he says, I have set before thee, thou shalt call these things to mind, call the blessings and the cursings to mind amongst all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath driven thee. So who is it that is actually driving Israel to these nations? Who is scattering them amongst all these nations? Well, God tells them, it's me. I'm going to actually scatter you. I'm going to use these nations to do it, but I'm going to be the one who is ultimately responsible for scattering you. And he tells them why. He says that the blessings and the curse which I have set before thee, you shall call these things to mind among the nations. So God is actually telling them that I'm going to give you these commandments. I'm going to give you all of these things. And then what I'm going to do is, I'm going to sit back and watch. You people are going to drift away of your own free will. But when it happens, I'm going to scatter you. And then when that happens, you're going to take that information and you're going to disseminate it into those other nations. And that's pretty profound and amazing there, because what you have is, in just that sequence there, you have both the sovereignty of God and you have the free will of man, the responsibility of man. God tells them, this is what's going to happen. I'm telling you what's going to happen before it happens, but when it happens, this is what I want you to do. And then once that happens, I'm going to do this. And he's telling them, he's laying it out for them right there. So you go on down, verse 2, 3, you really should read this entire chapter, but God is telling them in verse 3 that, he tells them, after you scattered around, and then in verse 3, he says, the Lord thy God will then return, or turn thy captivity to compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord thy God hath scattered thee. So he's telling them, okay, now that I've told you, you're going to take the land, you're going to go into the land, I know you're going to drift away. When you drift away, you're taken into these other nations. I want you to tell the other nations what I've told you about their law, your relationship with me, and things like that. And then when that happens, now that I've got all of these other nations' attention, now that you've gotten all their attention, then I'm going to bring you back into the land. Think about that for a second. Think about how God is actually using these other nations to judge Israel, and then he's using Israel to then get the message out about his relationship with Israel to all of these other nations. And he shows, once he gets all these other nations' attention, then he blesses Israel, and all these other nations are like, that's pretty amazing. So and then in verse 4, you can go through here and probably, verse 4 to about 9, I want you to read all the places where it says the Lord thy God will do this. The Lord thy God will do that. And he's telling him here that he's responsible for all of these things. The Lord thy God will gather thee. The Lord thy God will fetch thee. The Lord thy God will bring thee. He will do thee good. The Lord thy God will circumcise the heart and the hearts of your seed. You know, things like this. It's all of these things is talking about the sovereignty of God. When it talks about the Lord thy God will do this, he's not saying, if you do this, I'm going to do this. It's not like that. When you read this and you look at its context, he's telling them, I'm going to do these things. Regardless, this is what's going to happen. And in each and every case, as we start going through this, there's not a lot of if circumstances. It's the Lord thy God is going to do these things. And you people are going to drift away. And what he's doing is he's opening their eyes to their own sinfulness and their own depravity and showing them that, look, if I just sit back for a minute, you people will drift away. And when that happens, I'm going to get all these other nations' attention, and then I'm going to bring you back to me. And that is then going to send a message to all these other nations that I love you, that you're my children, and that I'm bringing you in. And it's just kind of amazing there. I think we're going to probably cut it off here. But read this chapter, because we're probably going to talk about this more like the rest of this week. There's a ton of stuff in here. So anyway, all right, you guys, God bless.